Good? You are now. Okay, well then we'll get started now, right? So I want to talk about navigating the FDA recommendations on med device security. If you were following some of the stuff that's been put out by the FDA earlier this year, they put out a set of draft guidance. And of course, it's draft guidance. It's a good thing for us, by the way, because we get a chance while it's in draft to actually comment on it and help shape these standards. All right. Now, how many folks in the room, just out of curiosity, work in medical device? Any of that? Like one or two or three? Okay, so not many. Maybe that's why I have such a small audience. What I should have done is said the FDA and how it's going to screw IoT security forever. That probably would have gotten a whole room packed full of people. I don't know. Hopefully Adrian records this and then we'll put it out on the web and that'll just be awesome. Anyway, so I want to talk about navigating the FDA recommendations. Again, it's going to secure all of IoT and change IoT overall. Internet of Things, by the way, if you're not familiar with IoT, which, by the way, in the whole buzzword bingo schema, I hate IoT. Right? It's confusing my grandma. It's confusing my mom. She doesn't know what to think about IoT security, except that it'll probably kill us all, according to the last Wired article she read. Right? Who am I? I'm passionate about security. I love security. I've been in InfoSec for more than a decade. I do forensic analysis, incident response, love vulnerability research. I'm a SANS instructor and a course author. And I'm also a diagnosed conference addict. All right, so between SANS and outside of SANS, I'll probably do 20, 25 of these this year, easy, which is probably the only person in the room that has me beat is probably Adrian upstairs, who records at least 20 or 25 of these things a year, probably more actually. Adrian's just a machine. All right, so the agenda, I want to talk about, does this apply to you, even if you don't build or use or implement medical devices? Well, let's step back for a minute, because if you go to the hospital, you use medical devices, whether you really use devices or not. You may not use them on a daily basis, but one of those things is going to be hooked up to you, and believe me, you care, because some of the stuff we're going to talk about here is pretty darn scary, right? But does it matter to you? The answer is yes. Even if you don't plan to go to a hospital because you're a Luddite and actually that doesn't make sense. You wouldn't be here if you're a Luddite and hated technology, but you get the idea. Even if you're not concerned with that horrible scenario, right, where your internet-connected defibrillator is attached to your chest, right, even if you don't care about that scenario, and you should, right, so you should, does this still apply to you? And the answer is without a doubt, yes. We're going to talk about the FDA's recommendations because, well, that's kind of what we're here to talk about. Even if you don't care about the FDA, how are these going to apply to IoT devices? We'll talk about that as well. A couple of things you may not have thought about from that perspective. And then what actions can you take? I actually have some recommended recommendations, right? Because I certainly am commenting on the FDA draft proposal because I understand how widely reaching this thing's going to be. Hopefully after you guys leave today, guys and gals leave today, you'll want to do the same thing. Reach out to the FDA and say, hey, some of this stuff doesn't really make sense. Maybe you should involve, I know, don't fall down, involve some actual information security professionals in drafting the standards for information security for med devices. All right? I mean, it sounds like common sense, but I promise you when you read some of this, it's not common sense. All right? So does it matter to me? I ran out of languages. Look, yes, absolutely this matters to you, without a doubt, right? Even if you don't care at all about medical devices, of course it does, right? That's zero question about this, right? It definitely matters to all of us. This is a quote from the FDA's draft guidance, their draft proposal. Who has the con? Who's in charge of medical device security? Now, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, okay, scratch that. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, who's in charge of medical device security, I'd have told you that it was a partnership between the manufacturer and the implementer. All right, so who manufactures it, and then who ultimately buys it and hooks it up to a patient. All right, so the hospital, the doctor's office. Now, the FDA recognizes that medical device security is a shared responsibility between stakeholders, including healthcare facilities. Okay, check, I had that one a couple of years ago. Patients. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me scratch that one for just a second because that doesn't make any sense to me. All right. Providers and manufacturers of medical devices. So this is kind of interesting because they put providers in there, not the manufacturers. Who's the provider in this sense? Right? And it turns out that that can be a third-party integrator. So, for instance, if you hired a consulting company to come in and help build your medical device network, yes, again, your medical devices are networked, right? That would be one of your potential providers. Certainly in healthcare facilities, that makes sense. Your providers, your care providers, is another way that you can interpret that as well. But patients. Really? Me as a patient, I have a responsibility for my medical device security? I can sort of maybe see this if you're talking about from a physical security standpoint, right? But otherwise, this scares the pee out of me because grandma, when she's hooked up to the IV pump that has an Ethernet port on the back of it that can't be disabled, this is not a hypothetical scenario, that can't be disabled, that has a remote root CGI web vulnerability, meaning the web server is running as root and there's CGI on the web server. Tell me again why your IV pump needs a web server? Yeah, I didn't know either, right? Your IV pump running as root has remote command injection unauthenticated on a port that you can't turn off. Grandma doesn't know about this. In fact, when I asked Grandma, do you know about the Ethernet port on your IV pump? She said, what's an Ethernet? And where can I get one, right? And I said, never mind, right? Again, as a patient, even if I'm an informed patient, the people sitting in this room, can I go get a firmware? Can I get that for my pacemaker? Can I get that for my defibrillator that I'm going to be hooked up to? Whatever that is, it's network connected. And of course, the answer is no. No, I can't get that in most cases. And even if I do, can I reverse engineer it to look for security holes? And thanks to the DMCA, the answer to that may also be no. All right, I may not be able to legally do that. No, by the way, if you think the DMCA exceptions apply there, you're probably wrong because we're talking about loss of life or potential for loss of life. So I'm not really happy with this implication right off the bat that patients have some stake in their own medical device security. If we're actually going to roll with that, if that's the plan, we're going to say patients definitely have a stake here. We've got to define this. We have to redefine this and make this something sensible. I'll get off my high horse here because that got me so riled up when I read that because I thought about trying to do something, trying to come back and say, oh yeah, no problem, I've got this taken care of. Me as an InfoSec professional with more than a decade of experience, I can't honestly secure my own medical devices. Grandma, again, has no chance. My mom, no chance either, and she's been a medical professional for, all of my life, right? I've been a medical professional. She's a director of nursing in a mental health hospital, previously worked in a neonatal intensive care unit. She's a technotard, right? So at the end of the day, she has no hope of working with us either, right? Okay, let me come back to the FDA's recommendations, right? Not just the scary stuff that they threw out there about whose responsibility it is. The FDA, as it turns out, pulls the recommendations out of NIST, right? So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. How many people are familiar with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework? That is an outstanding number of hands. I am so happy to see that, right? If you're not familiar with the NIST CSF, become familiar with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It is something that you are going to see a lot. Now, personally, I have to tell you that I am 100% tied to, and of course I'm biased, right? But tied to the SANS 6-step incident response process. Right? Now, a lot of people are like, well, that's just because you work for SANS. No, it's because of what I grew up on. Right? Long before the CSF existed, before the cybersecurity framework existed, we had the SANS 6-step incident response process. And it turns out these 5 steps versus the 6 steps, it's the same darn thing, right? They just combine 2 of the steps, and they don't have a lessons learned step. Anyway, NIST CSF categories, we're going to walk through these: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. It's romper room for cybersecurity, right? Again, if you can't work this out, you're in the wrong field. So we come into identify. And I would love to tell you that I made this up, but first, I'm not an artist, so I definitely didn't make it up. Second, I don't have the creativity to be this bad, right? So one of the things we have to ask is, as far as identify within our medical device standards, the identify is identify a problem. This turns out to be the lightest section, and it really only deals with risk assessments. Now, when I think about cybersecurity, we talk about identifying problems. I'm thinking about all kinds of monitoring and how do I do baselining and how to forget about it. None of that. There's not a mention of baselining network activity. There's not a mention of identifying the protocols in use. There's nothing, period, in the FDA recommendations about this. Now, again, this should concern us because ultimately, whatever the FDA is doing, the FTC is going to pick that up as a standard, and that's going to apply to all of IoT. Your internet-connected toaster that we hear so much about, and I'll even run through an IoT horror show a little bit later because we are now connecting things to the internet that we absolutely should not be. And I'm not talking about the dam up in New York or which is pretty fun to say, right? The damn New York thing. Anyway, so all of our SCADA devices, not even talking about that. There's stuff in your home that's being internet connected, that's getting into the downright scary. But coming back to identify, right? All this deals with is risk assessments. And I'm a little concerned that these categories look really, really fuzzy, right? That we start talking about critical and catastrophic and serious or impact to health, right? If the vulnerability is exploited, what's the impact? Is it serious? Is it critical? Is it catastrophic? We need to know. Now, when I step back and I think, okay, well, cool, we've got this little risk matrix, and how exploitable is it, right? Well, this is good, right? So I think, okay, the FDA is going to take a vulnerability, a known vulnerability, right, for that pacemaker that's been implanted in my chest, and they're going to figure out for me at this point, is it medium exploitability? Is it high exploitability? Then they're going to look and say, what's the likelihood of it causing serious bodily harm? And they're going to roll that matrix together, and they're going to say that if it's dark black, it's uncontrolled risk, and there are certain things you're required to do for uncontrolled risk. I think, okay, that's good. Problem is, who gets to define the severity impact and the exploitability? The vendor. So you find a vulnerability, and you go report it back to the vendor, and the vendor analyzes the vulnerability, not the FDA, not the vendor with the FDA cooperation, nothing. The vendor, by their lonesome, evaluates both the criticality of the bug and the exploitability of the bug. Now, without getting into, is this a smart move? Let's just remember that the vendor wrote the vulnerable software and built the vulnerable device in the first place. They are in no position, in this man's mind at least, they are in no position to evaluate the exploitability of the bug. I've been in this a long time, not just med device, but in InfoSec for a long time. I do a lot of vulnerability research. I've discovered and privately disclosed lots and lots and lots of O-days. Consistently, vendors tell me consistently the exploitability is low. The discoverability is low. Astronomically low, I'm told very often. You would have to be Rain Man to be able to exploit this, to get code execution, and routinely, again, we do. Which tells me that clearly I'm Rain Man. I had no idea before, but now I know, right? Thank goodness. So we've got this going on here now where the vendor gets to define both the severity impact as well as how exploitable is it. This is really, really scary to think about the vendor determining the impact. I think it's scary, right? And I'd like to buy a vowel here. Can anybody pick this one out? Yeah, totally, right? You can't seriously tell me that you believe for a moment, right? Vanna doesn't even believe that the vendor's going to do a true, unbiased assessment of a particular vulnerability for devices when they have tens of thousands of them in the field. Tens, hundreds, millions, right? If you think I'm wrong, let me tell you a little story about a particular device that was released or that vulnerabilities were discovered for last year. There was a device called a PCA pump. The company PCA, as it turns out, makes this IV pump. Right? And it turns out that most of the PCA pumps were totally vulnerable. And they came back, and I swear I can't make this stuff up. They said, don't worry. Yes, it's vulnerable. Yes, it has unauthenticated root-level telnet. Let that sink in for a second. You telnet into the device, and you type root, and you get a freaking prompt. If this isn't scary, I don't know what is. They say, don't worry. Yes, it's an IV pump. Yes, it controls drug delivery. But as root, there's no way for the attacker to modify drug delivery. Right, exactly. I feel like I'm in a stand-up room, right? That the Apollo or somebody's going to walk up with a cane and drag me off for giving out bad jokes, right? They say, don't worry, because from the one side, you can only update the drug library, and then there's a separate processor. And then the first question is, okay, good, there's a separate processor that controls the delivery that, by the way, again, is sent from the drug libraries. But how do those two communicate? Because clearly they must. And they said, don't worry about it. That's proprietary. No hacker could figure that out. Now, at the time, Rendition, the company that I own, was working for a large medical device, a large medical facility who had previously told us for legal reasons we had discovered this vulnerability almost 9 months before it was made public. They made it public back to the vendor, but it was a controlled disclosure. Then separately, another, I say discover the vulnerability. Look, we discovered lots of vulnerabilities. Our recommendation was put these things in a pile and burn them, right? Do not hook these to a patient, ever. And to be honest, we didn't discover all the vulnerabilities that this guy did because, again, once we discovered 3 or 4, like, obvious, like the remote root telnet, it's game on, right? You couldn't change this. There was no way to disable this. It's just stop, right? And so, again, these clowns came back. They were awesome. Lawyers, if you're watching the video later, they weren't clowns. They were awesome, and I'm sure they were very, very good at their jobs. No, they weren't, right? Anyway, these guys came back and they said the exploitability was low, and they said don't worry because the impact to the patient would be minor if exploited. Exploitability low because you would have to have specialized knowledge to understand how to update the drug libraries. Now, I'm not going to go try and kill a patient here because there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these PCA pumps still out in the field, right? And I won't tell you that even if you disable the wireless that it doesn't matter because there's an unsecured Ethernet port on the back that you can plug into at will with physical access, and you probably don't have to worry about that because they're probably all out there anyway. I'm not going to tell you how to update the drug library, but my 9-year-old could figure it out in a matter of minutes. So I'm just going to throw that out there. So the exploitability definitely wasn't low. It's a good documented case of really, really poor risk assessment. And look, honestly, if you update the drug library and grandma's connected to the IV pump and it's delivering morphine or whatever it is that they're delivering there, the impact ain't minor. Right? I'm sorry. If it's exploited, the impact is absolutely not minor. And I'm positive if they thought they could have gotten away with it, they would have rated it negligible. Right? So when we start talking about this and we say, well, could that really happen? Would the FDA be asleep at the wheel? I think the answer is, we hope not. We hope the FDA wouldn't be asleep at the wheel. That being said, we've seen documented cases where companies have come out and made some, let's call them for legal reasons, overly optimistic, actually take that back, potentially overly optimistic assessments of the vulnerability classes, right? Okay, so that's great. So we're through identify, right? Let's talk about protect. This again comes right out of the FDA standards. I wish I had more time to talk about this. I really, really do. I've only got 45 minutes, so I can't go through every individual recommendation, but I do want to pull a couple of these out here. My favorite one, by a long shot, has to be the idea that we're going to limit the access to the devices via biometric authentication. Just out of curiosity, how many folks have server rooms that require biometric authentication? Right, so your med devices aren't going to have it either, right? I see like 1 or 2 hands are like, yep, I've got biometric identification on my server room, but not your med device, right? Your defibrillator is not going to have biometric ID. And to be honest with you, when the paramedic rolls up, I don't want the defibrillator to require biometric ID. I can see that going wrong in about 1 million different ways, right? I want doctors to have access to all the devices they want to use. My favorite one here, though, after we get out of biometric, is the appropriate authentication, multi-factor authentication, right? Again, I'm struggling right now to get companies to deploy, organizations to deploy multi-factor for remote access. Please, just deploy multi-factor for VPN off, right? And I'm getting pushback on that. You can't seriously tell me that you expect to see multi-factor on these devices. Now, some people will tell me, Jake, you're a pessimist. In fact, scientifically, as it turns out, I'm a pessimist. My business partner, Ed McCabe, does a lot of natural language processing with some threat intelligence stuff that we're working on at Rendition. He pulled down my blog and he pulled down my last, 3 or 4 weeks of Twitter feed, and he went through and he said, hey, Jake, you're negative more than 68% of the time. He's like, you're just a negative guy, right? And we start looking at, is this tweet negative? Is this blog post negative? Scientifically, I'm a negative guy. I'm a pessimist at heart. That being said, this isn't a shoot for the stars kind of thing. It's a just get it right minimally. Because the problem is when we go in, if you're in security, you know this already. When you go in and you try and tell someone, hey, here's what you need to do for security, and you throw a lot of stuff at them. You come down and you say, here are the 380 things we need to do for security. What do they say? No chance. There's no way we can do it all. Right? And I hate seeing stuff. I wish we had a minimum set of recommendations. Something almost like the used to be SANS, now CIS 20 critical controls. Something that's bite-sized that we can just step back and say, okay. Right? Something small to pick. Again, you see this, for example, multi-factor authentication. You're like, well, that clearly doesn't apply to me. And then you just stop reading. Psychologically, we've looked at this. We know that people just give up on this. What about protect? Who thinks it's a good idea to merely avoid hard-coded passwords in your medical devices? Can we not come up with a better standard? I mean, yes, this isn't draft recommendation. I get it. But is avoiding enough? I mean, would it have been too strong of language for the FDA to step back and say, hey, if you do this, you're liable for patient death. If you hard code passwords, particularly for service accounts or root accounts in your device, right, you're just going to be liable. No, they said let's just avoid that. Avoid it when possible, right? So, and by the way, let's not make our passwords common words. And I'm happy for this. Again, I appreciate that they've kind of tacked some of that in there, but if all we have to do is avoid that, I feel like again, we're kind of dropping the ball here just a little bit. I do like the second one, right? Where appropriate, we want to put physical locks on devices and any communication ports, right? So we want to physically restrict access to the communication ports. Recall grandma sitting in the nursing home attached to maybe she's not a nursing home, I don't know, but attached to that device. I don't want somebody to be able to come in there and plug into the device with an Ethernet cable and start going there. Right? Certainly user authentication, I like that. User authentication or other appropriate controls before permitting software or firmware updates. Now, if you've never worked in med device or IoT before, I know you're looking at this and you're like, come on, in what crazy land, right, would you be able to just overwrite the firmware without first authenticating? And the answer is all over the place, right? So this was absolutely required for us to put this in here because huge numbers of medical devices, huge numbers of IoT devices, particularly if you have physical access, you can just overwrite the firmware. This obviously is a huge big deal for us, right? So certainly here, user authentication, good. But again, this is really a mediocrity kind of thing, right? This is the kind of stuff where we're just catching up catching up honestly from 10 years ago. So we want to restrict software or firmware upgrades to authenticated code. I like that, right? So it talks about such as code signature verification. Okay, good. I like this whole signed firmware update piece, right? It's a non-binding recommendation. Again, everything we're talking about here is currently non-binding. It's draft form, pre-publication. Now, you kill a patient today, I'll bet the money in my pocket. I'm not a lawyer, right? But I'll take the money out of my pocket and I will bet the money in my pocket that the FDA is coming after you and they're going to grade you against these non-binding recommendations today. I bet the same thing if you have an IoT device and the FTC gets a hold of you, right? Because if it's not a med device, the FTC is coming after you. If it's a med device, the FDA gets to come after you. So, again, code signature verification, I like that. Right, I want to make sure that we can download only identifiable firmware from the manufacturer. I like that as well, right? When appropriate, use encryption. Sorry, I need to step back for a moment. When precisely, can anyone tell me, because I'm curious, when precisely is encryption not appropriate when you're doing firmware uploads, firmware overwrites? Yeah, I can't come up with a scenario either, right? So when appropriate, use encryption. I'm kind of in the mode of if you're transferring data to or from the device, and again, let's not forget this is a medical device, right? So if the data that we're transferring from the device is my patient information, I certainly want this to be certainly want it to be encrypted. I can't come up with a time when encryption isn't appropriate. So, I think what happened was the FDA, for the draft recommendations, they had a page count. They had a max page count. I write white papers occasionally. Folks will come back to me and they'll say, Jake, your max page count's 12. And I get on a tangent and I start going. I get on a tangent occasionally. Start going and I got like 8 pages in and I've covered like a third of the content. And I got to jam the rest of the content in the last 4 pages. I don't know if that's what happened here, if they just ran out of funding or whatever, because they just jammed the last 3 steps. Now, mind you, Identify sucked, right? Identify was that little... FDA, that didn't suck. Don't come after me, right? But the Identify piece was pretty marginal, right? I mean, it was kind of a graph. It looked a little weird, right? And then we pop back here and we say, okay, well, cool. We'll just jam the last 3 portions of the cybersecurity framework all into one piece: detect, respond, and recover. Again, this seems like mediocrity to me. I don't know whether they ran out of time or funding or whatever, right? But this is scary to me because, look, protecting the devices is important. But that was 1990s. The build a wall around it and don't worry about, basically the build a wall around, I hope it doesn't get hacked. That's 1990s thinking. It's 2016. It's start with the assumption of compromise. That's where we're all at, right? If anybody in here says, I built a wall around it and I hope I don't get hacked, dude, turn in your badge, go home, right? That's the 90s, right? Or get back in your DeLorean, hop back to wherever you need to go, right, where that was a sensible strategy. No longer, right? So detecting absolutely as important as securing the devices in the first place. So what does the FDA have to say about detecting, responding, and recovering? They have 4 things to say importantly. want to implement features that allow security compromises to be detected, recognized, logged, timed, and acted upon during normal use. And they give no further provision for how this is going to happen. Again, this is a huge mediocrity problem because I've talked to manufacturers who have read this, and they've come back and they've said, no problem, we've got it covered, here's what we're going to do. We'll make sure in this case that we log any access to the device. And I say, cool, where are you going to log that at? On the device. Well, do you offer remote syslog? No. Do we need remote syslog? Yes, you need remote syslog, right? Is it even an option? No. Is it the default option if you have it available? No. Right? So, again, we want to make sure that we can detect these compromises. What do you actually log? Well, that's another one that's huge there. Is the logging sufficient to be able to detect a compromise? Obviously, another big problem there, right? I'm going to skip, we'll talk number 2 here for a moment. Develop and provide information to the end user concerning the appropriate actions to take upon detection of a cybersecurity event. Again, my mom is an absolute technotard. Because she's a technotard, I have the Jake's Mom standard. All right? It's an actual rule that I apply to, is this a big deal in InfoSec? Right? And if Jake's mom has heard about it, it's a big freaking deal in InfoSec, right? She called me about Heartbleed, right? Because she heard me on the radio talking to somebody about Heartbleed, but that was neither here nor there. She called about it, and the fact is, I don't talk on the radio about normal med device compromises or whatever. Heartbleed, yeah, absolutely, right? She called me about shell shock, right? That's how I know when these things elevate up. Do I have something to be worried about? No, well, yes, but there's nothing you can do about it, right? Because you're not on a Mac, you're on a PC. God, I can't even imagine my mom on a Mac. That would be horrible. But anyway, my point is here, my mom and all the technotards like her can't spell cybersecurity, let alone respond to a cybersecurity event. All right, I feel like we need to get a little bit more prescriptive in what we're talking about here. All right, so a recommendation that I would push forward, and we'll talk some more about these later, is that I want to make sure that we've got good information to the end user, and the device is updatable by the end user in a secure fashion such that they can respond to a cybersecurity event. If my mom's got an insulin pump, or I think for a pacemaker she's probably going, but an insulin pump, I don't want to have to go back to the doctor to get that thing reset or to take care of vulnerability. You get the idea, right? Number 4, I'm going to skip number 3 for a second, but provide methods for retention and recovery of device configuration by an authenticated privileged user. I like this as well. Sounds like forensics to me, and I love forensics. This seems, again, like this shouldn't be a big deal, but I promise you it is. There are some devices that the way that I get the configuration off of the device is I log in, or in many cases I don't log in at all. I just open the web page to the device because there is no login, and I take a screenshot of what the current configuration is. And I'm not kidding. In many cases, that's the best way, documented way that I have to get and back up the configuration of the device. That's scary, right? So I'm glad the FDA is doing this. This enables forensics. Take a look at number 3, though. Implement device features that protect critical functionality even when the device's cybersecurity has been compromised. Now, I like this idea, right? Just like I like unicorns that poop rainbows. They're outstanding. They're cute to look at. Device features that protect critical functionality even when the device's security has been compromised. How does one do that precisely? And this is where I ask, which InfoSec, by the way, did anybody in here help the FDA write these draft recommendations? Okay, good, because we were going to slug it out here on video. That would have been awesome. But I want to know, seriously, who came up with this? I mean, it sounds great. It sounds like something that my mom would say, right? Even if a hacker gets a hold of it and gets root access, she wouldn't actually say root. Even if a hacker gets a hold of it, even if Abby Shudo manages to hack into it's one of her favorite characters, apparently, but manages to hack into the device. We want to make sure that it continues to function normally. I don't understand how this works. If anybody knows how this works, please hit me up after the talk. All right, so I'm a little confused. Look, Microsoft tried this. They tried valiantly to do this. Starting with Windows Vista, they said, hey, if you want a 64-bit driver loaded into your system, meaning you're running 64-bit and you want a device driver loaded into your system, you have to have a code sign. How well has that worked? Not very well. I've bought more fraudulent code certificates than I care to admit. Right, and I'll just leave it there. It's the bar to get a code signing certificate very, very low. We're not even talking about Microsoft grade security here. Certainly, FDA is not going to be trying to do any of that with med devices. Again, Microsoft tried this. The idea being that even if you're compromised, you won't be compromised at the kernel level. And they tried valiantly, and they failed at every step. And this is not a knock on Microsoft, because they tried valiantly. They did more than more than a lot of organizations, a lot of companies, vendors have tried to do. Again, if Microsoft can't pull it off, the vendor that last week was running an unauthenticated root telnet prompt, right, on your med device can't pull this off either, right? So, does the FDA stuff apply to generic IoT? Absolutely yes, right? FTC has already hit companies up with fines. ASUS, you probably read about earlier this year. They fined ASUS for poor security. If you bought an ASUS router, it turns out you got cloud storage with it as well. And it turns out not only did you get cloud storage, but everybody that wanted your cloud storage got your cloud storage as well, right? Turns out this is bad for you if you like security. By the way, if you're in security and you're using that kind of cloud storage, come talk to me before you keep using it. It's a giant liability, right? So, look, the FTC has a couple of IoT security recommendations of their own. The reality is the FDA has the shiniest devices to protect. It's you and me, right? The FDA wants to implement a standard for medical devices. The FTC is not going to reinvent the wheel. The FTC is actually not known for reinventing the wheel. They're known for grabbing other standards, right? The only reason that they currently have a few standards for IoT security, and I say a few, they are really weak, is that FDA's standards are only in draft. Now again, you kill somebody with your IoT device today, I guarantee you'll be graded against the draft standards as they stand today, right? You should care about this. If you even use IoT devices, you should care about the medical device standards. Again, the FDA recommendations are currently non-binding. You as a security professional get to determine the future shape of these. All right, so even if you don't do medical devices, this still impacts you. Let's talk about IoT horror shows, right? Because I love some of the stuff that's being connected. A lot of people say IoT. What are we really talking about here? I travel all the time. I kid you not. I have something called an egg minder that actually tells me how many eggs I have in my fridge and how fresh they are. And it tells me so that as I'm stopping at Walmart on my way home from the airport, right, where I travel so much that I kid you not, I have my own parking space at the Augusta airport. It tells me whether or not I need to buy eggs, right, in case I wanted eggs, or are they rotten in the fridge? It tells me that too, right? Again, this is the kind, now, that's probably not going to impact my cybersecurity. Well, maybe it could a little bit, because it's connecting through my Wi-Fi, but I've got to segment it for obviously good security reasons. My coffee pot, right? Should my coffee pot be Wi-Fi enabled? Well, I could make a pot of coffee, or 2 or 3, maybe tops, and yeah, maybe it would make a mess, and that would be about it. Now I'm starting to get a little scary here, right? Because now we're talking about using the slow cooker from my phone. So, yeah, maybe I mess up the stew a little bit. All right, we were planning on, maybe the meat's a little dried out. Okay, got it. This solves a problem I didn't even know I had. All right, but apparently, if you too find yourself being summoned by your employer while you're in the shower, fear not, there's a Bluetooth shower head for that with a speaker and a microphone. So, again, didn't know I had the problem, but they've already solved it for me. This sounds like a bug that I put in my bathroom, right, that can, be used as a listening device in my bathroom. I sing in the shower all the time. You probably wouldn't want to hear it, right? This is where it gets scary. Because what is this again? A frickin' pressure cooker, right? Your pressure cooker probably, actually, let me just rename this. It's not a pressure cooker, it's a bomb. And it's not the biggest bomb that we're going to look at here in the IoT horror show, but it is a bomb. Turns out that if you want to stay connected, and look at how happy she is to preheat her oven from wherever the heck she's at, clearly not home. She's preheating her oven from her phone. Okay, cool, right? Neat. But you can preheat it to burn the house down later, right? I feel like, again, if there's the oven. So I can come up with some nightmare scenarios here. Maybe we're just wasting energy. I don't know. But it seems kind of weird to me. This one's my second, third, fourth, somewhere in their favorite. I'm getting there, right? This is the dryer, and you can extend your dryer cycle. Now, I had a friend of mine when I was growing up, and his house actually burned down because his dryer, they left some clothes in the dryer, right, a little bit, and they were going to grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and they're going up to see Peaks of Otter or something. And it turns out the dryer didn't shut off, and they were going to be gone the whole day. About 4 hours in, the lint trap or something caught fire because the dryer heating element is still going. Again, you can keep extending your dryer cycle from, don't worry, there's a security control there. You know where the control's at? In the app. All right? Guess who can bypass that? Anybody with the app. That one's cool. But this is where it gets fun, because I've seen Mythbusters. All right? And it's a water heater, a.k.a. the big bomb that blows up the house. Now, I know they've got to disable the valve, and that's not a big deal, and you'd have to have physical access to do it there, and yeah, I'm still not okay with that, right? So again, you can crank the temp way up, way down, way up, way down. I think it's Stuxnet, right? Spinning the centrifuge, and certainly, again, remotely you can break stuff, maybe you blow something up, I don't know. I don't have you convinced yet, but you can control your gas fireplace remotely from your phone. What could go wrong there? Lots of stuff. But if you're not scared yet, the Defibrillator Readiness Network should make you pee your pants, right? Because it's an internet-connected defibrillator. And I actually had to pick up the phone and find out why. Because I had to know why. Why is this a thing, right? And it turns out the reason this is a thing actually has to do with saving hospitals money. And it turns out that when they transfer you from the emergency room up to that cardiac step-down unit, that there actually has to be something called ACLS certified. I used to be a paramedic back in the day. I was ACLS certified. It's Advanced Cardiac Life Support. And somebody that's ACLS certified has to be there to monitor the patient. And it turns out that some of these regulations haven't kept up with the time, and it turns out that monitoring the patient can be done remotely. And so the hospitals now are saving money with that one ACLS certified nurse and just rolling you away with the defibrillator. Guess who gets to make the choice whether or not to shock you? You didn't have to guess. Never mind. Anyway, you get the idea. This is some scary stuff, right? And if it's not scary to you, again, check your pulse. Never mind. This thing will do it for you. Okay, so actions that you can take, right? Talk to your legislators. Pick up the phone. Dimes to dollars, your legislator has no idea that the FDA put out standards at all. And if they do, they have no idea that they just put them out this year and they're still in draft form and that they were done very, very poorly. You start with, I am a professional in this field and I'm blown away by the quality of these, right? Again, let them know you care. Almost nobody does. Look, medical device and IoT security, it's a complete clown show. I mean, it really is, right? We can make it better, but it's only us. Right, so without your help, the clown show is going to continue. What solution can you offer to your device manufacturers, integrators? Let me give you a couple ideas here. Wi-Fi, sure you need it. Everything's better with Wi-Fi. It just is. Right? And manufacturers will tell you this. If two devices side by side, even if one has better features than the other, if the one with lesser features has Wi-Fi, it'll get picked up 10 times out of 10. Even if Wi-Fi isn't needed. Right? Because it has Wi-Fi and it offers options for not running cable line, right? So, do you ever need open Wi-Fi? Let me follow up with that though. You need Wi-Fi, I got it. But should open even be an option? My answer has to be no. Open causes all kinds of problems. What about web? Yeah, I know we got some old infrastructure. I work in organizations with old infrastructure, right? But web should never even be an option. Never. Ever. TJ Maxx, web, right? I can start listing down other compromises, web. Don't ever run web. Never, never, never. Should not even be an option. Because if it is, somebody will do it. All right? Again, worked with a large hospital, large enough to know better, that was running their medical devices. Said, don't worry, we put a firewall up, and we segmented them. And I said, cool. And I looked at the wireless authentication, and they were all sitting on a WEP-protected network. Wow. I have med devices on a WEP-protected network. Again, including drug delivery devices. Woohoo! All right? As far as recommendations, the firmware has to be digitally signed. No hard-coded passwords, right? The FDA dropped the ball when they said just avoid them, right? Remove HTTP entirely. Only offer HTTPS support, period, right? Same thing for Telnet versus SSH. Telnet has no place on your devices today, period, end of story, shouldn't even be an option. What about device certificates being static? We see this too. A large number of our devices, you buy 50 devices, every one of them has the same digital certificate. And that's cool until you gain access to the firmware and download the private key. And now I can masquerade as all of those devices. And that is clearly a problem for your healthcare people like my mom who are technotards and only know to look for the little stop sign that Chrome puts up, right? Chrome or Firefox puts up. What about unauthenticated USB? Because there are crazy numbers of devices that are great with, they're abysmal with network protections too, but when you plug a USB port into the back there, a USB cable into the back, they say, welcome, what can I do for you? No authentication required, right? Or if there is authentication required, it's authentication in the terms of a hard-coded password that's well-known around the internet, right? So unauthenticated serial and we're seeing manufacturers already moving to this, where I've looked at several med devices over the last year that have a custom port, right? And I know it's a custom port because I look at the back of the device and it says weird, I don't have one of these, and I go online and I order a cable, and as soon as I look the cable up, and I see that there's this weird twist-on cable, and the other end of it's a frickin' USB cable, what is it? It's USB, or it's serial, or it's, I don't care what it is, as soon as you plug that thing in, right, again, you've got that unauthenticated access, right? So again, you run into this, absolutely, again, just horrible, horrible things are going to happen, right? I'll track you down and beat you up myself if you design one of these devices like that. This is my obligatory question slide, right, where I have to ask, does anybody have any questions about everything we've talked about? Anybody? Okay, then oh, you have a question? Flip to... Yes. What would I recommend instead of static certificates? That's an outstanding question, right? When the device boots up for the first time and or after a firmware update, right? Because odds are good in most devices, the firmware update's going to wipe the certificate. When the device boots up for the first time, it generates its own certificate. Just like when you start up SSH for the first time, if you don't have keys available, think about Linux. You start up SSH for the first time, it generates keys. That's what I want to happen here, right? Now, you as the implementer, you as the guy that rolls that guy or gal that rolls that out onto the floor and implements that, no problem. You'll get that certificate. You're going to catalog that and whatever you do regular key management with. And I know this complicates key management a little bit, but the security impacts otherwise are disastrous. So, does that answer your question, by the way? Awesome. So I've got like 4 minutes left before I break. How many folks are CEH? I think 4 minutes. Am I right? Give or take? Okay. So I'm not a CEH, as it turns out. How many folks know the EC Council website has been serving malware using the Angler exploit kit for the last more than a week and a half? Yeah. So if you happen to be a CEH or a CHFI, please contact EC Council. They won't take my call. Because I picked on them too much over the years, right? But I did write an open letter to them today, saying, hey, you're screwing our industry here. We'll actually come and clean your system for free, clean your web server for free. So again, if you happen to have pull with them, just say, please, right? Just take their help and stop serving up malware, right? Separately from that, I've got a couple of handouts up here. I didn't bring up, I guess, enough for everybody, but I've got the 12-step program for breaking insecurity. Again, this is something you should show your bosses. If you're addicted to insecurity in your organization, you know who you are, right? Separately, too, the 10 Commandments of Exploit Mitigation, right? Which really come down to segment your network, right? But these are good little handouts. Again, drop by, grab one of these, or we've got more down at the booth downstairs. Sir? Okay, so that's a great question. Just so I can repeat it so everybody can hear it. The question is the FDA working with NIST, and if so, how, to develop these recommendations? To my knowledge, the FDA hasn't worked with NIST directly to implement or to design these recommendations. They simply modeled them after the NIST cybersecurity framework. So if you read the whole document, it's 26 pages that will absolutely cure your insomnia if you suffer from that. But again, it's basically they come through and say that we're looking at the NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework, and we're using that just because so many people use it in the field. They're just trying to map it back to something. And I actually praise the FDA for that, right? Because they're not reinventing the wheel. Far too often, people reinvent the wheel. So, yeah. Anybody else? Well, okay. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Please call your congressman, right? Or send them something and say, and if you work for EC Council or know them, please call them up and say, please stop serving malware off your site. But no, seriously, for your Congress, please call them up, talk to them. They absolutely want to hear about it. Cybersecurity is big in the news, and they swear that the FDA and their other regulatory bodies truly are addressing this stuff. If you leave with nothing else, leave with the understanding that the FDA does not have the wheel on this. All right, and if they do, they barely have the wheel on it, and you're on an icy road. With that, I appreciate your time. Thank you, guys.